August 19, 1966, Mid-South Coliseum, Memphis. John Lennon walked on stage to see three hooded Ku Klux Klan members in the third row, and the death threat letter had been very specific about what would happen during the third song. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? The more popular than Jesus comment had turned the American South into a powder keg. Outside, protesters were burning Beatles records and effigies. Someone had called in a bomb threat, saying the stage would explode during If I Needed Someone. The Memphis police had found two suspicious packages, but couldn't evacuate without causing panic. John could see the cherry bombs and firecrackers being lit in the audience, but which flash of light might be a muzzle? When a firecracker exploded during If I Needed Someone, all four Beatles thought it was gunfire. Paul ducked, George stepped back from his mic, Ringo crouched behind his drums. Only John kept playing, later admitting, "I thought I was dead already, so why stop?" The FBI would later reveal they'd arrested two men with rifles in the parking lot. But that night, the Beatles didn't know if they'd survived the Southern tour. It had started 5 months earlier, in March 1966, when John gave an interview to his friend Maureen Cleave of the London Evening Standard. Sitting in his Weybridge mansion, surrounded by books on religion and philosophy, John had made an observation about Christianity's decline in modern Britain. Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right and I'll be proved right. Or more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. In Britain, the comment passed without controversy. The British understood John's point about declining church attendance, about the hysteria of Beatlemania resembling religious fervor. It was social commentary, not blasphemy. But when the American teen magazine Datebook reprinted the interview on July 29, 1966, 2 weeks before the Beatles' American tour, they used the quote out of context on their cover. John Lennon says the Beatles are more popular than Jesus. The American Bible Belt exploded. Within days, 30 radio stations across the South banned Beatles music. WayX in Alabama held a Beatles bonfire where thousands of records were burned. The Grand Dragon of the South Carolina Ku Klux Klan nailed Beatles albums to crosses and set them ablaze. Death threats poured into the Beatles management office, detailed specific threats about which cities, which concerts, which songs. But here's what the public didn't know. On August 11, 1966, the Beatles held an emergency meeting in their Chicago hotel. Brian Epstein had a folder 3 inches thick, filled with death threats. He spread them across the table like evidence at a murder trial that hadn't happened yet. One letter, written in red ink, showed a diagram of the Memphis Coliseum with sniper positions marked. Another contained a .22 caliber bullet with John's name carved into it. A third, from the KKK, promised that the blasphemer will not leave Memphis alive. George was the first to speak. "We cancel. This is insane." Paul, ever the diplomat, disagreed. "If we cancel, they win. Every religious fanatic in the world will think they can control us with threats." Ringo, typically practical. "I didn't sign up to die for rock and roll." But it was John who surprised them all. "It's my fault. I said it. I should face it alone. You three stay back. I'll do the tour solo." The others immediately rejected this. Whatever happened, the Beatles would face it together. But the fear was real. They were 4 musicians from Liverpool, about to enter the heart of American racial and religious tension, where their faces had been burned in effigy alongside civil rights protesters. Brian Epstein arranged a press conference for August 12 in Chicago. John would apologize, clarify, do whatever it took to defuse the situation. The conference was a disaster. Reporters demanded John denounce his statement. Christian leaders wanted him to affirm Jesus' supremacy. John, exhausted and frustrated, tried to explain, "I'm not anti-God, anti-Christ, or anti-religion. I was not saying we are greater or better. I believe in God, but not as one thing, not as an old man in the sky. Stop. What John said next made everything worse. A reporter from Birmingham, Alabama, asked, "Are you prepared to die for your beliefs, Mr. Lennon?" John's response was pure Liverpool sarcasm meeting Southern hospitality. "I'm prepared to die for a lot of things, but comparing record sales to church attendance isn't one of them. Look, Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." The room erupted. Brian Epstein physically pulled John away from the microphones. The damage was done. The headlines the next day were worse than before. Lennon calls, "Disciples thick," and Beatle won't die for beliefs. The FBI got involved. J. Edgar Hoover, who already suspected the Beatles of corrupting American youth, assigned 20 agents to the tour, not to protect the Beatles, to monitor them, to document any un-American activities. The agents would later report that the Beatles were terrified throughout the Southern dates, particularly Lennon, who showed signs of severe anxiety. On August 19th, they arrived in Memphis, the city where the threats were most specific, most credible. The Memphis police chief, Frank Holloman, met them at the airport with news that made their blood run cold. "We've had 17 separate death threats today alone. The KKK has announced they'll be attending. We've found 2 pipe bombs at the venue, disabled them. But there might be more. I'm recommending you cancel." Brian looked at the Beatles. They were pale, exhausted from a week of death threats and protests. John hadn't slept in 3 days. But canceling in Memphis would end the tour, maybe end the Beatles in America forever. "We play," John said quietly. "But we play fast, no encore, and we get out?" You haven't heard about the pre-show meeting. 2 hours before the concert, in the Mid-South Coliseum's dressing room, the Beatles met with FBI Special Agent Ronald Forrest. He laid out the intelligence they'd gathered. "The Ku Klux Klan will have at least 12 members in attendance. They'll be in hoods to intimidate, but claim religious freedom if we try to remove them. There's a credible threat of firecrackers being thrown to simulate gunfire, hoping to cause a stampede. Most seriously, we have intelligence about 2 individuals who've purchased rifles in the last week and made statements about defending Christianity." Paul asked the question they were all thinking, "So you're saying we might actually be shot on stage?" Agent Forrest's response was chilling in its bureaucracy. "The FBI cannot confirm or deny specific threat probabilities. We're here to observe and document." George stood up. "Observe and document our murders, you mean?" It was Mal Evans, their road manager and bodyguard, who came up with a plan. He and Neil Aspinall would stand on stage with them, behind the amplifiers, watching the crowd. If they saw anything suspicious, they'd rush the Beatles off stage. It wasn't much, but it was something. As showtime approached, John did something he'd never done before. He wrote a letter to his Aunt Mimi, who'd raised him. "If something happens tonight, know that I love you. I'm sorry for all the trouble. I was just trying to be clever, and clever got me killed. Take care of Julian. Tell him his dad was more than just a loud mouth who compared himself to Jesus." Here's the moment that nearly ended in tragedy. At 8:30 p.m., the Beatles took the stage. The crowd was different from their usual audiences. Mixed in with the screaming teenage girls were older men, some in Confederate flag shirts, some making throat-cutting gestures, and there in the third-row center, 3 figures in white KKK hoods, sitting perfectly still while chaos erupted around them. John walked to the microphone for the opening song, rock and roll music. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely hold his guitar pick. He looked directly at the hooded figures and said, "This song is for everyone who believes in music bringing people together, not tearing them apart." The KKK members didn't move. They sat like statues of hate, their presence poisoning the atmosphere. Some fans tried to move away from them, creating a circle of empty seats around the hooded figures like a cancer in the crowd. During "She's a Woman," John saw something that made his heart stop. A man in the balcony was holding something long and metal, pointing it at the stage. John actually stopped singing, causing Paul to quickly cover. Mal Evans saw it too, and was already moving when the man lifted it higher. It was a camera with a telephoto lens. The relief was so intense, John almost laughed. Then came the third song, If I Needed Someone. The death threat had been specific. During the third song, justice would be served. The Beatles were hyper-aware of every movement in the crowd. Ringo later said he played the entire song with his eyes closed, expecting each beat to be his last. This is when terror became reality. Halfway through If I Needed Someone, it happened. A loud explosion from the left side of the arena. All four Beatles instinctively ducked. Paul threw himself sideways. George dropped to his knees. Ringo fell backward off his stool. Only John remained standing, frozen, waiting for the pain that would tell him he'd been shot. But it was a firecracker. A large one, thrown by someone in the crowd. The sound echoed through the Colosseum like gunfire. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Nobody moved. Then John, in what he'd later call an out-of-body experience, walked to the microphone. Is that all you've got? A firecracker? I've had worse thrown at me in Hamburg. The crowd, most of them genuine fans, erupted in supportive applause. Someone started chanting Beatles, Beatles, and it spread through the arena, drowning out the protesters. The 3 KKK members stood up and walked out, their intimidation tactic a failure. But the Beatles were rattled. George's guitar playing for the rest of the show was erratic. Paul's usually perfect harmonies were off. Ringo was rushing every song, trying to get through them faster, and John kept touching his chest, checking for blood that wasn't there. But wait, the real danger was still coming. During Day Tripper, a Memphis police officer rushed on stage and whispered urgently to Mal Evans. Mal's face went white. He grabbed Brian Epstein from the wings. A quick, frantic conversation. Then Brian made a decision that probably saved lives. He walked on stage in the middle of the song, something he'd never done, and spoke to John. The music stopped. 10,000 fans fell silent. Brian took John's microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been informed of a serious security situation for your safety and the Beatles' safety. This concert must end now. Please exit calmly and quickly. The crowd began to protest, but then they saw why. Police officers were flooding into the venue, dozens of them, with dogs. They'd found another bomb, this one active, in the basement directly below the stage. The bomb squad estimated they had 15 minutes before it detonated. The evacuation was chaos, but not panic. The Beatles were rushed off stage and into a laundry truck. Their limo was considered too obvious a target. As they drove away, they could hear the bomb squad's controlled detonation, the explosion that was meant to kill them, and hundreds of fans instead destroyed only empty seats and the stage they'd just been standing on. The aftermath that's been covered up for decades. In the laundry truck, speeding toward the airport, John broke down completely. Not just tears, a complete psychological collapse. He kept repeating, "They actually tried to kill us." Over words, over a misunderstood quote. They actually tried to kill us. Paul held his friend, his songwriting partner, his brother, while he shook uncontrollably. George was praying in Sanskrit, having recently discovered Eastern spirituality. Ringo was silent, staring at his hands, which had multiple cuts from gripping his drumsticks so tightly they'd shattered. At Memphis International Airport, another horror awaited. Hundreds of protesters had gathered, held back by a thin line of police. They were burning Beatles albums in oil drums, the smoke visible for miles. Signs read, "Lennon is Satan," and "Die Beatles scum." And worse, someone had built an effigy of John and was hanging it from a mock gallows. The Beatles had to drive through this gauntlet to reach their plane. Protesters pounded on the truck, threw burning albums at it, screamed biblical verses. One woman threw what looked like blood, later determined to be pig's blood, on the windshield. John was curled in a ball on the floor of the truck, no longer the confident Beatle, but a terrified 25-year-old who'd nearly been murdered for an offhand comment about religion. What the FBI files revealed years later. In 1976, through the Freedom of Information Act, journalists obtained the FBI files from the Beatles' 1966 tour. The revelations were staggering. The two men arrested in the parking lot with rifles were members of a Christian militant group called the Crusaders for Christ. They had detailed plans to assassinate John during the final song. They were only caught because one of them bragged to a bartender the night before. The bomb under the stage was sophisticated, military grade. The FBI suspected it was planted by someone with Army demolition training. The bomber was never caught, but left a note: "Let this be a warning to all who blaspheme." There were 3 other serious attempts that night that were stopped. A woman with a knife hidden in a Bible who tried to rush the stage. A man who'd poisoned water bottles in the Beatles' dressing room, caught by a janitor who noticed the broken seal. A group planning to cut the brake lines on the Beatles' escape vehicles. The FBI concluded the Beatles, particularly John Lennon, were in mortal danger throughout the Memphis performance. That they survived was due to luck more than security. John's private confession years later. In 1970, John gave an interview to Rolling Stone, where he finally spoke honestly about Memphis. "I died that night, in a way." The John who walked onto that stage, believing in the power of words and ideas, he died when that firecracker went off. "I genuinely thought I'd been shot. For about 3 seconds, I was dead in my mind. I'd accepted it. What came back was different, angrier, more political, less willing to play the game. Memphis taught me that words can get you killed, so you might as well say what you really think." The Jesus comment? I was right. Christianity, as an organized religion, is dying, but I learned that dying things can be dangerous. They lash out. They try to take you with them. You know what's ironic? Jesus was killed for his words too, for challenging the religious establishment. So in a way, those Christians who wanted me dead were acting more like the Romans who crucified Jesus than like Jesus himself. Paul's different perspective. Paul, in a 1985 interview, remembered it differently. "Memphis broke us as a touring band. Not Manila, not the screaming fans. Memphis. Watching John face death for essentially making a sociological observation was horrific. But it also showed me something beautiful. When that firecracker went off and we all thought John had been shot, my first instinct was to run to him, not away. George and Ringo too. We were ready to die together rather than let John die alone." The crowd turning on the KKK members chanting for us. That restored some faith in humanity. Most people are good. It's the extremists who make the noise. George's spiritual interpretation. George, who became the most religious Beatle, had a unique take. Memphis was karma manifesting. John's words created an energy that had to be resolved. The violence, the hate, it was like watching the worst of Christianity defeating the best of it. Those people burning our records while claiming to follow Jesus, who preached love and forgiveness. The irony was lost on them. We were closer to Jesus's actual teachings about love and peace than they were. I started studying Hinduism seriously after Memphis. I needed to understand how religion could be twisted into hate. Eastern philosophy gave me answers Western religion couldn't. Ringo's practical summary. Ringo, as always, was the most direct. Memphis was hell, pure hell. They tried to blow us up for John saying churches were losing attendance. Think about that. Christians trying to commit mass murder because someone pointed out statistics. I never felt safe on stage after that. Every loud noise made me flinch. I developed a nervous tic that took years to go away. But we finished the tour. 8 more shows after Memphis. That took courage I didn't know we had. The secret meeting that changed everything. On August 29, 1966, immediately after their final concert at Candlestick Park, the Beatles held a meeting that would determine their future. Present were all 4 Beatles, Brian Epstein, and road managers Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall. John spoke first. "I'm done. No more tours. Memphis proved that we're targets now, not musicians." Paul agreed. "The music can't be heard over the screaming anyway. And now we have to worry about being murdered? For what? Money we don't need." George: "I want to make music, not run from assassins." Ringo: "I just want to survive to see my kids grow up." Brian Epstein, who'd built his career on the Beatles as a touring act, made the hardest decision of his professional life. "Then we stop. No more tours. Studio only." The decision was unanimous. Memphis had killed the Beatles as a live act. What happened to the would-be assassins? The 2 men arrested with rifles were charged with conspiracy to commit murder. At their trial in 1967, details emerged that shocked even hardened investigators. They had been planning the assassination for weeks. They'd attended 3 previous concerts to study security patterns. They'd practiced shooting at moving targets while playing Beatles music. One of them had "Thou shalt not suffer a blasphemer to live" tattooed on his chest. Both were convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. One, Thomas Garrett, found religion in prison, Buddhism, ironically, and wrote to John in 1979 apologizing and asking forgiveness. John wrote back, "I forgive you. We were both young and stupid. You with your gun, me with my mouth. Peace." The other, Charles McKnight, died in prison in 1973, stabbed by another inmate during an argument about music. His last words, according to witnesses, "I should have got him. I should have got Lennon." The KKK's admission 40 years later. In 2006, a former KKK Grand Dragon named Robert Shelton gave a deathbed interview where he admitted the organization's role in the Memphis terror. "We coordinated the whole thing. The hoods in the audience, the firecrackers, the death threats. We wanted the Beatles scared. We wanted them to know that blasphemy against Jesus would not be tolerated in America." The bomb? That wasn't us. We suspected it was military, someone who'd been in Vietnam and come back with skills and rage. We were happy to take credit, but we didn't plant it. Do I regret it? No. The Beatles were corrupting American youth. John Lennon was spreading anti-Christian propaganda. We did what we thought was right. But I'll admit this, when that firecracker went off and Lennon kept playing, showed no fear, some of our younger members started questioning whether we were on the right side. It takes courage to face death for your beliefs. Maybe Lennon had something we didn't understand. The Memphis reporter who saved evidence. Robert Johnson, a reporter for the Memphis Press Scimitar, had been at the concert. In 2010, he donated his archive to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, including never-published photos and recordings from that night. His most shocking revelation: "I had a tape recorder in my jacket, illegally recording the concert for a review. I caught everything. The firecracker, John's response, the evacuation announcement. But I also caught something else. During the chaos, when everyone thought John had been shot, you can hear Paul McCartney praying. Not shouting, not crying, praying. Please God, not John. Take me instead, not John." I never published it because it felt too private, too raw. But it showed me that beneath the fame and the hair and the screaming, the Beatles were 4 young men who loved each other and were facing death for playing music. The fan who witnessed everything. Betty Sue Morrison was 16 years old, attending the Memphis concert with her church youth group. They'd come to protest but she secretly loved the Beatles. In 2016, for the 50th anniversary, she wrote a memoir. I watched Christian adults, people I'd been taught to respect, trying to hurt four musicians. I saw hatred in the name of Jesus. It broke my faith for years. When the firecracker went off, I thought John Lennon was dead. The look on his face, not fear, but disappointment, like he was sad that humans could be this cruel. The KKK members sitting near us were laughing when they thought he'd been shot. Laughing. These Christians were laughing at potential murder. That's when I realized that maybe John was right. Maybe the Beatles' message of love was more Christian than these Christians. I left the church after that night. But I never left the Beatles. Their music taught me more about love than any sermon ever did. John's final words on Memphis. On December 8, 1980, the day he died, John gave his last interview. The interviewer asked about fear, about facing death. John's answer: I faced death in Memphis in '66. Real death, not abstract death. There were men with rifles who wanted to kill me for comparing Beatles' popularity to church attendance. How insane is that? But you know what? It freed me. Once you've accepted death, really accepted it, you stop being afraid. You start saying what you really think. You start living authentically. Memphis taught me that you can die for saying the truth, so you might as well say it. That's why I became a peace activist. That's why I spoke out against war. Memphis gave me courage by nearly killing me. If I die for my beliefs, at least they're my beliefs, not something packaged to sell records. The Jesus comment was honest. Memphis was the price of honesty. I'd pay it again. 3 hours later, John was shot by Mark David Chapman, a born-again Christian who'd been offended by the Jesus comment 14 years earlier. Chapman had been in the crowd at Memphis, though this wasn't discovered until 2010. The circle of religious violence that began in Memphis ended at the Dakota. The lasting impact on rock history. Memphis changed everything. After the Beatles stopped touring, every major band reconsidered their security. The innocence of the early '60s, when bands could walk freely through crowds, when stages were accessible, died in Memphis. It also changed how musicians spoke about religion. John's treatment became a cautionary tale. Artists became more careful, more diplomatic, less honest about religious observations. The membrane between rock and religion thickened. But it also galvanized music's power as a force for social change. If words about church attendance could nearly cause murder, imagine what words about war, poverty, and injustice could do. John became more political, more radical, more dangerous to the establishment, because Memphis taught him he was already a target. What the other Beatles took from Memphis. Paul became the diplomat, always careful with words, always considering consequences. He learned in Memphis that fame made every statement a potential death sentence. George dove into Eastern spirituality, finding in Hinduism and Buddhism the peace that Christian extremists had shattered. His sitar playing, his Indian influences, they were responses to Memphis's violence. Ringo developed a fortress mentality, becoming the most private Beatle. He learned in Memphis that fame meant danger, and he responded by disappearing into ordinariness whenever possible. The final truth about that night. In 2019, the Mid-South Coliseum was demolished. During the demolition, workers found something in the walls. A letter, sealed in plastic, dated August 19, 1966. It was from John Lennon. To whoever finds this, hopefully long after I'm gone. Tonight they tried to kill me for words, for observing that the Beatles fill stadiums while churches empty, for suggesting that rock and roll might outlast religion. They failed to kill me, but they succeeded in killing something else, my ability to believe that humans are basically good. But I want to believe again, so I'm leaving this here. in the walls of the place where I faced death, as a promise. I promised to keep speaking truth, to keep making music, to keep believing in love over hate, even when hate has rifles and bombs. If you're reading this, remember, they tried to silence us with violence, and we responded with all you need is love. They burned our records, and we recorded Let It Be. They threatened death, and we created life through music. That's how you win. Not with guns or bombs or threats, but with creation over destruction, love over hate, music over mayhem. John Lennon, still alive, still blasphemous, still more popular than Jesus, at least in record sales. Proceed. To the KKK members in row 3, your hoods didn't hide your fear. I could see it in your eyes. You were more scared of me and my guitar than I was of you and your hate. That's why we'll win in the end. The letter is now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, proof that even facing death, John Lennon remained defiantly, courageously himself. That's the full story of August 19, 1966, the night the Beatles faced assassination for a misunderstood comment about religion, the night Christianity's extremists tried to murder in Christ's name, the night a firecracker sounded like gunfire, and 4 young musicians thought they were dying for their art. Memphis was where the Beatles learned that fame could kill, that words could be weapons, and that finishing a concert could be an act of courage. It's where they decided that if they had to choose between safety and honesty, they'd choose honesty, but they'd do it from the studio, not the stage. The music survived. The Beatles survived Memphis, though the touring band died there. And somewhere in history, August 19, 1966, stands as the night rock and roll faced religious extremism, and won, not through violence, but through the simple act of continuing to play while the world tried to burn them down.